for tonight's presentation on the Federal Reserve, and it's being held here at the Grove City Library, and we've got a great guest panel. So everybody in attendance, I want to thank you for all showing up tonight, and everybody out there in video land that's going to watch it, I want to thank you for taking time and checking this out. That'll be a lot of fun. And Bob Wagner with the Conservative Cavalry is the gentleman that is putting on the demonstration tonight. And then we have an outstanding panel over here with Joe Bozzi, Brian Doran, and Jason Rink over here if he comes on up front. There you go. Got your camera all set. So let's go ahead and get the action started tonight. And Bob will give his, what is it, half-hour presentation or so on it, on the Federal Reserve, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, about half an hour. First, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is one of those topics that everyone's talking about, and so what we've done is we've thrown together this presentation, basically just to help to basically start the conversation, to make sure that everyone is aware of all the issues, how to discuss it out in public, and how to formulate your arguments. It kind of started, the way this all started was I started to hear all these comments. And my background is in economics. I teach finance and economics. Masters of Economics, and I work as a portfolio manager, or some people say I'm one of those evil hedge funds manager, or what was it, a vampire in charge of a blood bank the other day. And so, but what I kept hearing was, I kept hearing these comments that I just knew were just not true. And so what I did was, I put together this presentation just to challenge some ideas that I hear repeated over and over again. There's one of the great parables is the house built on stone. Because if we're going to go out there and we're going to make these arguments and we're going to take this up as a cause, we want to make sure that the arguments are solid, right? And so I put this presentation to see whether or not, to try to erode the sand. Is there any sand below some of these arguments of ending the Fed that I've heard, or not? So so basically, this is hopefully going to be a very constructive presentation where it's a learning experience. The stuff that I'm going to be talking about comes from what I've been teaching for, who knows how long. Everything I'm going to be talking about will be coming out of the textbooks. Everything that I'm going to be doing in this presentation, you can download, you can go take a look. But it's going to come from the economic textbooks of money and banking. And that's what I think most people, they've read books like the Critters from Jekyll Island, they've heard all these arguments, they've read conservative magazines. But unless you have a real solid foundation and the actual theory behind it, you can reach some funny conclusions. And the other thing is, I get in a lot of trouble for this presentation because I'm a leader of the Conservative Cavalry, and people are saying, "What are you doing defending the Fed? We want to get the pitchforks out." Well, I want to go back to one of my favorite parts of American history was the Boston Massacre. They were ready to, they got the pitchforks out and they wanted to torch those British soldiers, right? But John Adams stepped up and said, "No way. If we're gonna be a country, we got to give due process." And so what this is basically going to be a court hearing on the end of the Fed argument. I'm going to be the proponent of the Fed. I'm going to sit there and say I'm going to defend the Federal Reserve, and we really stack the deck against me a lot with the audiences. I deliberately invite people to come to this that I know do not hold my views, and I stack the deck 3-to-1 of people who definitely do not hold my view. But you're going to be able to get a good view of both sides in this presentation, and that is the ultimate goal. All right? We just did this presentation last week or so out of the Gehenna 912, and there's kind of a negative thing that happens with a lot of these events. Suddenly we say, I start getting attacked all over the place. This is going on at the Union 912 out at their group. There's a group of people that go around. I think it mentions 20 or 30 of us. Yeah, we have 20 people there. They come up and they'll harass me, and you get all these postings afterwards. I kind of hope you can get away from that, because all this is about a learning experience. The speakers shouldn't have to fear about getting out of here and having all these people attack them on the web and stuff. It gets kind of annoying. K-Ro's video, I always forget to recognize Roy. Roy will have the video of this out on the web at krosvideo.com. Roy does a great job videoing all the things that we do. Almost any conservative event, Roy will have a video of it. One of the things that, the nice thing about it is when we all get to the very end of this, we agree on one thing, competing currencies. That's one of Jason's big things. I see absolutely no problem with it at all. Anyone who wants to buy a currency, you can buy it. Currency speculation is nothing new. Anybody can take their dollar and buy a euro or whatever, they use whatever currency they want. And so as far as competing currencies, we all agree. So basically it's all about education, and here's why. Because as you can see, this is a great example of how important education is. This is basically proofreading is a dying art. What you say, here's just a couple of headlines that have made the newspapers. Something went wrong in jet crash, experts say. Right? That's journalism at its best. Here's my favorite one. Panda mating fails. Veterinarian takes over. Alright? I would have thought the editor would have been able to catch these. And last, and this is the time one, if strike isn't settled quickly, it may last a while. Alright? So once again, the whole purpose of this is an education. You're going to get both sides, and you're certainly not going to agree with both the panelists here. Many of you may know the stuff I've done with global warming. I've been battling global warming for the last 6 years, and what I did was I saw there's some serious flaws in this global warming theory, so I threw it together. But what was nice about the global warming theory was I really liked pissing those people off. Right? Now the problem is I'm angering some of my friends with this presentation. But the key is, once again, open your minds. Right? Whole key. Let's open our minds. We're going to have a nice little question and answer afterwards, so every question you'll have is a we'll be able to address. Now, this is what let's see. I can't remember why I put that slide. Don't be that guy. Oh yeah, the key is the key is when we go out and talk to the press and things. Many of us do stuff with politics. They're going to come up there and going to ask you questions. The key is we want to make sure that when we speak to the press or someone outside, we can articulate our arguments very, very succinctly and effectively. We don't want to be that guy who the media is always looking for to make a fool out of themselves. So that's part of what this presentation is about. All right, now we all like Glenn Beck. I love Glenn Beck. Okay, but I want to show you what happens when you turn a critical eye on Glenn Beck.
Has the country or any country ever devalued its way to economic prosperity? That you have to answer. I hope so, because that is the path our government is taking us down. The Fed can keep playing tricks to mask the real problems, but not for very long. Inflation, there's no masking the rising cost of inflation, is there? I mean, have you been to the grocery store? Here's what inflation is. A persistent substantial rise, a persistent substantial rise, a persistent substantial rise in the general level of prices related to an increase in the volume of money and resulting in the loss of value of currency. Got it? First part, substantial rise in the general level of prices related to an increase in the volume of money supply. So if they weren't printing anything, and this orange juice here was $1, and then they started to print more money, the orange juice would cost more because there are too many dollars out there now trying to buy that one glass of orange juice.
Now remember this formula, because that's the key to our discussion today. That's the whole basis of monetary policy.
Well, is that happening? The experts say, of course not. Really? Well, let's look around the world. Well, let's look around the world. Well, let's look around the world. UK's inflation levels hit 4%. Eurozone's inflation levels jumped to 2.4. And that ain't it. Experts are now predicting the new luxury item in America will be this. Orange juice. They say factory prices, and problem with drought. Factory prices could rise as much as 80% for orange juice and 60% for apple juice. Let me show you what is happening. The 6-month price percentage moves. This is 6 months. This isn't over a year. 6 months with just a few of the necessities. Here they are. Cotton is up 125%. 6 months. Sugar 82%. Corn 59%. Coffee 41%. Rice 40%. Let's look at some others. Oats, if you're a horse, panic. Copper 36%. Lumber, you want to build a house? Up 33%. Put some gutters on it, why don't you? Or just have that old-fashioned thing called electricity. Oil, 25.1%.
Now remember how we said aggregate prices is what inflation is.
During that same 6-month stretch, what has the dollar done? The dollar has dropped by 6%. Cotton is up 125% by 6%. Sugar 82 by 6%. Corn 59%. Every time we print more money, the value of your dollar that you have earned at work goes down, making the price go up by 6%. Let me tell you just about cotton. Let me show you a real-life example. This is cotton. Just in the last 6 months, cotton has gone up 125%. So you have to go out and buy a new shirt. This is a great shirt. This is a non-iron Brooks Brothers shirt. These are fantastic shirts. This shirt was, 6 months ago, $79.50. Today, it is $88. Here it is. But the real hidden trick is the hidden value of your dollar. It's like a hidden tax. The value in the same time of your dollar has dropped 6%. So you need to add another 6% to the cost of this. Because it takes more of your dollars to buy them. So it makes it not $88, but actually $93 for this shirt. Does that sound like a recipe for success? Especially when the government continues to spend and print.
Okay, see what I mean? If you apply a critical eye to what's actually being said, there's just mistakes all over the place. A finance professor would go nuts over reading that kind of stuff, or an economist watches that and just they scratch their head. The key is, if we're going to make arguments, we have to have arguments that are very solid. Otherwise, people will chew it apart, and that's not what the ultimate goal is. Okay, this is what monetary theory is based on, right? Anytime you talk about monetary policy, anytime you talk about the Federal Reserve, you have to be able to talk about this, right? And if you're reading articles and you're reading books and they don't ever mention this formula, that's not going to be a very good, you're not going to get a very good understanding of monetary policy. All right? Now what is this? M is the money supply. Velocity is the number of times that dollar is turned over. Price is the price level. The aggregate price level of when you average everything together. Not when you just go cherry pick what prices are going up, but you put the entire economy in a basket. All right? And then real output is the actual numbers of apples and oranges that you're producing. That's it. And literally, you can boil the Federal Reserve down into that simple formula. Okay? Now, when you deal with this, you normally assume that velocity stays the same. Okay? All right, you just assume that the normal dollar gets turned over 4 times. So let's say you have $1 in the economy, you have a velocity of 4, you have a price level of 1, that means you have a GDP of 4. It's that simple. All right? And under normal economic situations, you assume velocity is stable, okay? And for a given level of Q, or output, you assume that's stable. All right, now under that situation, what Glenn Beck is talking about, if you have fixed, if it's in the short run and your output is fixed, if your velocity is fixed, what happens if you increase M? You increase prices. So when people are out there saying, we're going to print money and get inflation, they're absolutely right if you can take an economy and throw it in a test tube. The problem is these variables don't remain fixed. And we're going to take a look at why you're seeing all this, you hear about all this printing of the money, and yet you don't really have inflation. And the way I measure inflation is by taking a look at the 10-year bond rate. It's still extremely low, near record lows. Right? Now there's some things going higher, but there's also things going lower. And so you don't really have inflation, at least not the inflation that the market concerns with. Okay? So, what the Fed tries to do, all right, the whole key, I mean, if you want to boil the Fed down into one simple thing, they want to have stable prices. It's called a price rule. So if you fix the prices, you assume a fixed velocity. If you increase the money supply at the rate of economic growth, so you increase M, the money supply at 3%, your economy grows at 3%, you have stable growth and stable prices. That's utopia. This is all the Federal Reserve does, day in, day out. They sit there and they try to figure out what M will lead to an increase in Q at the natural rate of growth and have stable prices. It's called a price rule. That is the Federal Reserve in a nutshell. So if you're going to talk about the Federal Reserve or you're going to talk about anything in the Fed, at least understand how the mechanisms work. Now we've got to start asking ourselves, what's going on? You know, why in the world are we printing all this money and yet these, the dollar hasn't collapsed, the inflation hasn't gone through the roof? Why are all these things that I'm told are supposed to happen haven't been happening? Now you're looking at this and you're thinking, why is Bob having a picture of Barack Obama on a bicycle? What does he have to do with the monetary policy? Well, when we go through what I'm about to go through, I want you to remember the analogy of when you're riding your bicycle, right? And that gear jumps, right? And it goes from 20 gear to 1 gear, right? What happens? You have to pedal a lot faster to go the same speed, right? You have to really pick it up or you're going to slow down, okay? So remember that analogy, and you're going to, if you can understand this analogy and apply it to that MV equals PQ, you will understand everything that's going on in the economy today, right? Now, remember MV equals PQ? Velocity. This is what I did was I went back and I got the economic data for the crisis period. So you can see what happened. Now, if you take a look, what happened to velocity? People got scared, so they held on to their money and they stopped spending money. So velocity fell through the floor, right? So what happened here? You got a fixed supply of money out there. You dropped your velocity, your Q, your price will drop, and your Q will drop, right? You go into a recession. That's what happens. So we saw it when the crisis hit, the velocity dropped. Okay? Now the other thing is we're in a fractional reserve system, right? And it relies on the banks making loans, right? They have something called a money multiplier, meaning that if I take $1, put it in the bank, that $1 becomes $10 in the economy. Well, what happened to the multiplier? It went from about 0.75 all the way down to about 0.75. So the money multiplier dropped. That's another gear that just dropped down, right? So now you're dropping, M's dropping, B's dropping, P's dropping, and Q's dropping. That is the Great Depression, right? That's what happens. You let the banks fail, your money supply disappears. With no money, the economy shuts down, right? So if you're the Federal Reserve, what is the only tool you really have? Right? They control monetary policy. So if you're the Federal Reserve and you're Ben Bernanke and you face this situation, what are you going to do? You're in charge. You're in charge of the most important economy in the world. Right? And you've got one tool. What are you going to do to try to reflate the economy? Everybody in this room, I would hope, would say, you better start jacking up the money supply real quick or we're dead. And that's exactly what they did. All right? Now, this is one of the issues I have with this end the Fed arguments. All right? Because there are just certain ways that you can tell a story that is very convincing, but isn't really telling the whole truth. It's a half-truth. This is a chart that you'll see printed over and over and over and over again. All right? And they'll say, the Fed is printing money. And sure enough, they'll show you this thing going from 800 billion to almost 2 trillion. Right? And they'll say, look, the Fed is printing money, we're going to have inflation. That's the argument they will make. Right? That is a fundamental error. Okay? That is, as you can see, I can understand how a journalist would make this argument, but an economist looks at that and says, you're not even talking, you're talking apples and oranges. This is the monetary base. Right? Right? An economist would say, well, that doesn't tell you anything. That means, I mean, if I turned on the printing press and had to print money and dug a hole in the ground and poured that money in the ground, it's not going to cause inflation. Okay? All they were doing is restoring the reserves in a bank. So they did print a lot of money. Right? But remember, the money multiplier was cut in half. Right? So you doubled the money supply, you doubled the monetary base, you cut the money multiplier in half, you work those two together to get money supply, and money supply basically stood the same. So what happened was the economy shifted down in the gear, so the rear gear shifted down, so the Federal Reserve shifted up in the front gear. But the speed of the biker stayed the same. The money supply, which is what is relevant to all this discussion, stays essentially the same. That's why printing the money was doing nothing more than filling back up what was draining out by the banking system. Okay? It wasn't really printing money in terms of money supply. It was just making sure the money supply could stay the same. They said, if all of a sudden the Fed starts printing real quick, it'll keep me alive. That's all they were doing. Right? So that's what they did. They printed money supply like mad, hoping the banks would loan to keep the economy reflated. So that's what they did. Print it, and hopefully the Q stabilized. We didn't go into a depression, okay? But that's exactly what the Federal Reserve did. And that's what kind of bothers me about all this the Fed stuff. I work in this field, and I get to watch it day to day. I'm watching the rates and stuff like that. And every time Ben Bernanke would do something, I'd say, thank God he did the right thing. And then I'd hear all these people criticize him going, are you guys nuts? Do you not study the Great Depression? What happens when you guys do what you just said you're doing? Okay? Now, here's the other thing. They're telling you that you print money, you're going to get inflation. You can test all these kind of charges. Right? Here's the CPI. In all these charts, what I do is I go back and I draw the arrows to the crisis period and the level of the indicator. So we printed all this money, right? Here's the CPI. The inflation fell through the floor. Okay? That printing money does not lead to inflation. It just simply doesn't. It did not. There's no evidence that it did. But once again, if you understand the shifting gear analogy, you understand why printing money doesn't lead to inflation. We're in a fractional reserve system, right? Now we also hear that it causes inflation in the commodities. Well, once again, here's the peak oil. Okay, this is crude oil, right here. Here's when we printed the money. We printed the money, and oil fell through the floor, right? Printing money didn't cause the inflation, right? If you watch Glenn Beck this week, what's he call? He keeps saying we're going to have $200 a barrel oil. Why? Not because of what the Fed's doing, but because of what's going on in the Middle East. There's three types of inflation. Demand driven. People just simply have more money and they buy more. Shifts the demand curve to the right. Supply shocks, which is OPEC. They can drive up prices. Right? So you can have demand driven, you can have supply shock, then you can have monetary policy, monetary inflation. Monetary inflation would increase the price of everything. Whereas what you have now are you have supply and demand shocks, not monetary inflation. Right? Here's the dollar. People keep telling me the dollar is going to collapse. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, I watch the thing every day. It's not happening. Okay, well, once again, here is when the crisis hit. They printed all this money, and the dollar actually increased in value. It is above where they started printing money. Period. That's the trade-weighted dollar index. Here's every commodity I could find. Here is agricultural. Here is natural. This is natural gas. Natural gas, they're giving it away after printing all this money. Here's livestock, and here are grains. Right? All these are lower than when they started printing the money. Right? So far, the printing of money has not led to inflation. Now here's QE2. Whenever they talk about QE2, quantitative easing. Now QE1, that's where you saw that spike up in the monetary base. They literally printed money. QE2, they're not printing money. They're what's called adjusting the duration of a portfolio. As the money comes in on the short-term debt, they buy the long-term 10-year. Okay, so they're not printing money now. But as you can see, this is when the QE2 was discussed at Jackson Hole. This is about where they implemented it. Okay, the whole key of QE2 is to lower 10-year rates. 10-year rates shot through the roof. Not really shot through the roof, but they're much higher than they were when they started it. Showing that the Federal Reserve does not control interest rates. The only interest rate they control is the very, very short-term overnight rate. If they did control the longer rates, you'd have lower rates today after QE2, not higher. And this went from about 2.4 to 3.2. That's a substantial increase on a percentage basis. Right? So once again, you'll be told the Federal Reserve controls interest rates, especially out at the long end. They don't. This proves it. Here's CRB. Once again, here's the crisis period. Dropped like a rock. We printed all this money. Here's QE1, and here's QE2. We're nowhere close to where we were before the crisis, and we've printed a whole heck of a lot more money. Dollar, once again, is strong. Now, the reason I'm really interested in this end the Fed issue is because, to me, it distracts from the real issues. The real issue to me is the debt. Okay, the debt doesn't have anything to do with the Federal Reserve, but people are always confusing the debt with the Federal Reserve. Zippo, right? The Federal Reserve is a bank. The debt is Treasury bonds issued by the Treasury, controlled by Congress. All right? So when you talk about the debt, don't blame the Fed, blame Congress. They get to spend the money. All right? Now, if you take a look at now remember the Federal Reserve, they had that balance sheet of $2 trillion. Our unfunded liability is $112 trillion. Right? The part of the debt the Fed owns is negligible. Right? The Fed does not fund our debt. It's just that simple. Here's who owns the Fed. If you want to blame someone for the debt, well, the U.S. government owns the debt. Your Social Security payments go to buying the debt. That's where all these Treasury bonds go. Here's $3 trillion. Now this is all. These numbers are pre-crisis levels. And the reason I have pre-crisis levels is because I want to show you the Federal Reserve had very little to do with the debt. Okay, but you and I have a lot to do with the debt. We bought it for Social Security. Our pension plans own it. China owns it. Japan owns it. Okay, but the Federal Reserve owns very little amounts of our debt. All right. Now, if you want to criticize the Fed, there's a legitimate criticism that I would say is we gave the Fed what's called a dual mandate. Okay. So whenever you talk about the Fed, you have to talk about the dual mandate. You might hear them say about, well, we need to change this dual mandate. Well, the problem is we've assigned the Fed two responsibilities: low unemployment and low inflation. Well, this chart shows you they're inversely related. They work against each other. If you get low unemployment, you get high inflation. If you get low inflation, you get high unemployment. But we're telling them we have to lower them both. The classic example is Scylla and Charybdis in the Odyssey. You know, Odysseus has to sail between those two hydras and the monsters, and he can't sway too far to one or he'll get eaten. So the Federal Reserve has to sit there and they have to chart this huge economy. It's a battleship, and they have to make it behave like a speedboat, right? But they can't go too far this way or they'll get inflation, and they can't go too far this way or they get unemployment. We've given them really, really tough challenges, so we've set them up for failure. If you really want to improve the Fed, you rewrite the rule to say get rid of the dual mandate and say, you guys worried about price stability, we'll worry about the unemployment. But right now we've given them two conflicting objectives. So once again, don't blame the Fed, blame us for writing a law that forced them into a situation that's very difficult for them. Now, this is one that I thought was kind of funny. Now my mom is a pretty doggone level-headed conservative, right? And when I see my mom sending me an email about an article, I said, okay, I got to add this one to it, okay? Everyone's seen this Alan Grayson video, right?
Oh yeah.
He absolutely makes that woman look like a fool, right? Right? But what's the argument that they're using as the Fed? We got to audit the Fed, right? Right? Everyone's sitting there saying, we're not auditing the Fed, we got to audit the Fed. Who was Alan Greenspan attacking? What was he grilling her over? He was grilling her over her audit of the Fed. Alan Greenspan's own video proves that you better believe they audit the Fed quite often, right? And he made her look like a total fool. He made her look like a total fool because Bloomberg released this thing about $9 trillion off the balance sheet. You know, get the pitchforks out. Ben Bernanke's giving money away to these foreign bankers, right? We got to go get the torches out. We got to get them, right? Now, Bloomberg releases this article about $9 trillion being off balance sheet. Did you ever hear anything else about it? Does that make sense at all? $9 trillion, almost our full GDP disappears and you never hear about it again? Does that make any sense to anybody at all? Huh? But we all bought into this. We all pass it around. Look at this. We're making it look like an idiot, right? Well, the reason
we don't know.
We don't. Well, we do know. The reason you don't hear about it again is because they looked at it, and Ben wasn't giving it to these foreign bankers. They gave it to the FDIC to make sure that when the bank went under, you got your deposits. They made sure that the Treasury got it because they just expanded their fiscal policy. They passed the.
How do you even
They all
know
went to
that?
the government programs.
How do you even know that?
Well, I'm using Bloomberg. Bloomberg, the one that released the story, released where the number came from. Now, here's the other one that raised my ire. And once again, just remember, I know I'm saying things that are challenging everything you've been told. Okay, that's the whole purpose here, and these guys are going to be able to tell you where I'm wrong. You watch this movie. One of the first things that really triggered it was I went to an event called, what was it called? Fiat Currency or Fiat Empire? Fiat Empire. Okay, and I saw this, right? And it said, Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. No state shall make anything but gold and silver tender in payment. And I saw that and I said, I about fell off my chair. Everyone got their little pocket constitution, right? All right, I will give anyone, now this is the whole basis of the movie, right? And remember the analogy of that house built on stone? If I'm going to go out and have a public event, and I'm going to use this as the foundation of my theory, right? I'll give anyone $1 million if you can find this complete quote in the U.S. Constitution, right? It simply doesn't exist. And if I was going to go out there and have a public forum to convince people that we're going to need to end the Fed, and I have to rely on misquoting the Constitution, I don't have a solid argument for my point. Okay? But when I saw that kind of stuff, I said, wait a minute, I at least have to bring it to the public's attention. The key is honesty, okay, and education. The other thing is we're talking about competing currencies. We already have competing currencies. Okay? That is why we are the world's reserve currency. Everybody wants to have their currency as being the world's reserve currency. And the reason I have so much confidence in the Federal Reserve and what we've done here in America is because when you look at the world, when they could choose any dollar they wanted, they chose our Federal Reserve. Good old Hugh over here in China, he is begging for us to keep crucifying the Fed because he wants his yuan to be the reserve currency. We have, I mean, this to me is like, you know how you say you don't know what you've got till it's gone? We are the world's reserve currency. You don't get any better than that. The Fed, there's no Federal Reserve in the world that comes close to ours. There's no currency that comes close to having the confidence ours does. And believe me, Hugh is out there trying to erode the value and the confidence in our dollar. Okay? This End the Fed project helps him get his objective accomplished. The whole key is, we're over there saying, look, Hugh, you're causing part of this problem because you deliberately undervalue our dollar, their dollar. People are always saying, we got to have a strong dollar. Not really. I mean, that's why China's so strong, is because they deliberately have a weak dollar relative to the dollar. They're weak currency relative to our dollar. That's why we buy all the goods from them, and they don't buy our goods, because they put them on sale. Okay. The other thing is the Federal Reserve. People are sitting there saying the Federal Reserve is a bunch of private bankers, or it's owned by the Federal Reserve is owned by you and me. When they turn a profit, they return that profit to the Treasury. Okay? Now, there's a lot of things about foreign bankers owning the Federal Reserve. That is absolutely true if we lived 200 years ago. Okay? The modern Fed is not owned by foreign bankers. It's owned by you and me. The other thing is, you heard about the Tarp. We went there and we heard about this Tarp. We're going to spend $700 billion. All right, get the pitchforks out. The Federal Reserve is going to blow this $800 billion or 800 or 700 billion. Right? That's what we all heard. Okay. The problem is Tarp is going to make money, and I kept trying to drive home. The message that the Federal Reserve is a bank. They don't get to spend money. Treasury gets to spend money, but the bank makes loans. So if you take a look at the part that the Federal Reserve is responsible for, they're going to make money on those deals. They bought low and they're going to be selling high. Now there are parts of Tarp, like the GM bailout and things like that doesn't have anything to do with the Fed. There's real problems there. But the part of Tarp that Fed was involved in basically saved this economy from going into another depression. There was bad parts of Tarp, but that was with the Treasury, not with the Federal Reserve role. People sit there and they're saying that food prices are due to the Federal Reserve. Read any article about why food prices are going higher. It's because we've had droughts around the world, and because we have India and China and the Middle East are buying a lot more food. That's demand driven. Nothing the Federal Reserve can do can slow down the population growth of China. That inflation is going to occur one way or another. Food chains. The Saudis. There's nothing we can do to control OPEC. They're going to jack up the price of oil whether the Fed prints money or not. That's just simply the way it works. The other thing is deflation. And I hope these guys address this. They'll tell you that deflation is good. And I'm telling you deflation is awful. You want to destroy an economy, you generate deflation. The Federal Reserve deliberately generates a little bit of inflation to prevent the economy from experiencing deflation. And we'll go into that probably in the Q&A, and I'll explain why. But deflation is a death sentence for an economy. This is basically the example they always use. They always use the example of back in 1913. Let me just finish a couple more things. World billionaires, people keep saying the people own the Federal Reserve. I challenge anyone to find, if you could actually own the Federal Reserve, the first thing you would do is what? Print money and put it in your bank account. I challenge anyone to find a world billionaire who labels themselves as owner of the Federal Reserve, yet they would easily be the wealthiest person in the world. You can't get a quote of the Federal Reserve on the stock exchange. And there's so many rumors. I mean, the Bilderbergs own it, the Rothschilds own it, the Council of Foreign Relations own it, Cabal foreign bankers own it. You know, they all can't own it. But the bottom line is, we own it. Here's something just as far as the audit. You can audit the Fed yourself. This is the balance sheet. Banking systems are very important. You know, that's how we get our student loans, our farm loans, our auto loans. Most of us rely on a healthy banking system to improve the quality of our life. You can get too far with it, but as you can see, you know, that's what we need. The other thing is funding wars. The Fed doesn't fund wars. We issue war bonds to do that. And so once again, it's you and me that funds the wars, not the Federal Reserve. To show you that you don't need a Federal Reserve to get yourself in a mess, the pigs, the Portugals, India, Greece, and Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, they're all deep in debt and they don't have a Federal Reserve, right? But they got themselves in a mess far greater than we did because it's the spending that's the problem, not the central bank. Our states are in crisis and our cities are in crisis because they spend more money than they've got. That's not because of a central bank. Just do a couple more things real quick. In the last meeting here, some people threw some ideas that I would never have thought about. We have a Supreme Court that's unelected. Well, the Federal Reserve is unelected people for a reason. We want them to be independent. Right? Now, the Federal Reserve is set up like a republic. Right? We give them a set of rules. Low unemployment, low inflation, and we're going to measure you by that benchmark. Okay? Now, the alternative would be, and they threw out, was that we should have the Treasury issue dollars. First of all, the Treasury is why we have the debt to begin with. But if you put the Treasury in charge of issuing currency, this is who gets to control the money supply. I mean, I would never even have thought of that idea, but I had this town hall last week and someone said that. I said, are you kidding me? But this is what they're arguing for. Okay? Also, we've had the Congress in charge of a bank before. That's what Fannie and Freddie were. Trust me, you put Congress in charge of a bank, they'll destroy anything. Been there, done that. You know, you see the Congress has already gotten us. Basically, the whole key is the Federal Reserve is set up like a republic. We gave them a set of rules and we measure them like a benchmark. If they do a bad job, we get someone in there to run it differently. We've been paper money's been part of our history since the beginning. That's a continental. So people are always railing about paper money. That's how we won the Revolutionary War. People will say that the dollar is unconstitutional, or the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. It is not. It is clearly outlined in Article 1, Section 8. Powers of Congress can coin money. Counterfeiting, it is not counterfeit money. Counterfeiting is when a body non-authorized produces money. Congress is clearly authorized to produce money. The other thing that was kind of funny was I went back and I took a look at the history of central banks in America. They keep telling you it's unconstitutional. Well, if you take a look back here, they had a debate over whether or not we could have a central bank or not. Well, guess who won the argument? Out of all the founding fathers, who's the number one guy? George Washington, right? Hey, I would trust his judgment. Well, they had their argument over whether we could have a central bank or not. And sure enough, George Washington said, hell yeah, we can have it. And you want to know why? But it was kind of funny was the arguments. Okay, they had the arguments back in 1791. They're going to be owned by private bankers. Yes, private bankers did own this. Okay, we were a young country. We didn't have the reserves. We had to get gold from overseas. Okay, and they're saying foreign ownership of these bankers. You know, those were the criticisms back there. So when you hear these people saying foreign owners of the central bank, they're right 200 years ago. Not applicable today. Okay, so here's the first central bank. Right, approved by George Washington. Lasted for 20 years. That means this unconstitutional bank making counterfeit money lasted through George Washington's term, lasted through John Adams' term, lasted through Jefferson's term. All three of our major founding fathers seem to not have a problem with the central bank. Now Madison comes along. And you want to know what? He bought into this argument. It's unconstitutional, we got to get rid of the central bank. He did. Guess what happened? The economy collapsed. Guess what he did? He started the second central bank of America. All right? So he creates a central bank. He ends it. You got a depression. He creates the second one. And guess what happens? Someone comes along again, and what does he decide to do? He decides to end the Federal Reserve. And what happened when Andrew Jackson did it? We fell into the worst depression we had. 6 years, very deep depression. Okay, so we ended the Fed twice, got a depression twice, and each time the government came back and said, that was a mistake. Okay, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. There is part of the, you hear the secrecy argument. There's a reason why some parts of the Federal Reserve actions are secret. It's to prevent people like me from getting in the system. If I know what the Federal Reserve is going to do, I could buy bonds or sell bonds in advance of what they're going to do. It's kind of like knowing the way a game's going to end. Okay, so there are legitimate reasons why the bank would be secret. They also say the period before the Federal Reserve was great. Here's all these are all the depressions before the Federal Reserve. 1 page, 2 page, 3 pages of economic collapses before the Federal Reserve. The economies were nightmares before the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to leave it right there. I just wanted to basically throw those questions out.
I thought you were going to show the ones after, but you didn't really.
Wait.
It's a couple pages. We'll get to that. No problem.
You'll be able to, you can address those. That's why we have a panel here. So if I'm pulling the rug out from under you, these guys do. Here's the bond rates. They're extremely low. If there's inflation, the bond rates will go going through the roof. Once again, people are fighting for the currency. Oh, and the last thing, I hope you asked about this, Michael, is the biblical quotes about the den of thieves. All right, because this is an interesting one as well. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay.
And we'll go from there.
Okay, let's give a round of applause for Bob Wagner. As usual, he got a little windy and stuff, but I think this is a good way to go because I know everybody in the room probably is chomping at the bit to ask questions and bring us some good things. So let's go ahead and give the panel over here an equal time to respond to everything. So why don't we go ahead, because of time limits tonight, why don't each one of you guys take like 10 minutes to give your own spin to talk about this, and then we got 3 guys here, and then we can open it up to the room, and then you can ask questions to each other. So
here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and give some individual opening statements, and then we're just going to kind of riff on what we've heard, and Bob can chime in the last 1 minute. Like I
All right, go ahead. Brian, you want to start off?
Good, yeah, well thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. So Bob had kind of pretty much 45 minutes of uninterrupted time, and I'd actually be willing to give him 5 or 10 more of my time if he could do a couple of things. So I mean, I first want to sort of stipulate, as the lawyers say, stipulate and say decent chunk of that I would agree with. And I mean, we're coming from exact opposite sides of this debate, but a lot of his criticisms of the Glenn Beck clip, totally valid. So it's, from my perspective, in large part, just straw man arguments, and if there's time, we'll get to go through and tell you, which ones are correct and which ones aren't. With the additional 5 minutes that he can have, and he can have basically all of my time, well, let me preface it with saying, I come at this from an economic angle. So it's not as much about the constitutional arguments, although those are there. So, as Bob knows from our previous debates, basically the underlying economic arguments for criticizing the Federal Reserve primarily come from what's known as the Austrian School of Economics. It was named because some of the founders came from Austria, and that kind of, those are people associated with that, like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. In 1974, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics for what he had built on the Misesian theory of capital. So they sometimes call it the Hayekian capital theory. And he really kind of took to the next level, explaining how the Federal Reserve creates these distortions in the marketplace, specifically around what he called the capital structure, and that it leads to malinvestment. And so I would just kind of leave it there and leave my time and give Bob back all the time that he wants, and from my point of view, concede the argument. If he could explain, not even critique, but just explain what the Hayek's theory of capital was and how it results in malinvestment, or even what he meant by malinvestment.
You want to respond to that, Bon?
Well, you guys can speak and then I'll respond.
So I'm Joe Bozzi. I have a degree in economics from the College of the Holy Cross, so but I won't be talking about anything in those textbooks over there for a very good reason. Because when I was in school, something became very obvious as studying these formulas like MV equals PQ. And you might have heard Bob say this word several times. It's simple, it's simple, it's simple. The whole economy, the whole complexity, millions of choices occurring millions of times a day across our broad economy, condensed down to one simple formula. And that, when I was in school, that struck me as a little odd. I'm thinking, gee, that sounds like Soviet central planning almost. What if we created this board and they're responsible for figuring out what the price of milk should be? You know, how good of a job would they do? We'd have a disaster just like the Soviet Union. You know, and here we are with the money supply, which is even far, it's the interest rate, the price of money is the most important price in the economy. And here we are with just a handful of people to figure out at any given time what that price should be. And there's some interesting quotes I have from some economists about MP equals Q. Hazlitt and Anderson criticized this theory as being just overly simplistic. It's good in that it shows the relationship between the quantity of money and prices, which is a good thing on a very broad level. But to try to manage the entire supply of money and all the prices, here you got basically got a guy deciding what should the price of stuff be in our economy. How does he know? Prices need to fluctuate. They need to go up, they need to go down in order to have a flexible economy. Just a couple of other quick things. There's a lot here. One of the things we try to get at is exactly what is causing the ups and downs in the economy. What's causing the business cycle? And Bob said the economy was a disaster prior to the founding of the Fed. Well, I've actually got a paper from two economists at the University of Georgia, and they compared all the data prior to the Fed and after the Fed. How are we doing on unemployment? How are we doing on booms and busts in the economy? How are we doing on price stability in the economy? And on all three, they actually found that we are worse after the Fed than before the Fed. And all the data is right here. It's all sourced. I don't know what your source for your data is, but it's all sourced right here. And one of the reasons why a lot of people say the economy was worse, particularly with Andrew Jackson, he talked about how Andrew Jackson got rid of the Fed and the economy went into a collapse. What economists were looking at was prices. The prices went down with Andrew Jackson, and they said, oh, the economy was a disaster, we were in a depression. And when they looked closer, they found the economy was actually expanding faster than it ever had in its entire history. So we had prices falling, but the economy was growing and wealth was growing in the economy. So this boogeyman of deflation, they had to get rid of it, and they had to revise it and say the economy was actually great at this time while prices were falling. And again, we see this again in 1920, where this bubble was created of credit expansion, and the bubble collapsed. And then in 1920, the Fed did nothing. So we had massive deflation. Prices fell like 40%. Yet in 18 months, the economy was back on its feet again. So is deflation bad? Yes, in the short run. But what the deflation is, it's the economy trying to restructure itself, because when you pump excessive credit in the economy, you artificially raise prices above the natural rate of where that price should be. The bubble grows, it pops, and then the prices want to go back to their natural rate. But the Fed is trying to pump it back up. And that's the difference between the Great Depression and the Depression in 1920. 1920 you never heard of, because the economy recovered quickly because the Fed did nothing. The Great Depression lasted, for a very long time. And one last thing on the constitutional argument. The two quotes are just from two different parts of the Constitution. I don't think that's such a big deal to show the two different parts together, but maybe it is. The Constitution only mentions monetary policy twice, but, and those are the quotes that, that Bob showed, but 4 years after the Constitution, because the Constitution was very vague, and we went through this period where you've heard the term not worth a continental, the paper currency became worthless. So there was this very negative view of paper currency, so that's why they specifically mentioned gold and silver in the Constitution. 4 years later, they passed the Coinage Act of 1792. And this is where they got into the details of what the U.S. Monetary policy should be. And it's where it defined a dollar as 371 grains of silver, and they defined the quarter in terms of silver. So this is really the Constitution was very vague, and they came back and they put in the details, and they said, because of the experiences with the Continental and the ability to just print paper money like crazy, and it became worthless, and they were having, the troops started demanding that they be given food instead of paper currency because it was so worthless. They wanted to create a currency backed by gold and silver. And one interesting thing here, the penalty for debasing the currency, every such officer or person who shall commit any offense of debasement shall be deemed guilty of felony and shall suffer death. So they were so serious about debasing the currency that the penalty was death for doing that in the Coinage Act of 1792. So there's a lot more than I'll let you
and
see.
we'll ping pong it around here for a little bit. So I agree with two things specifically that Bob said. Well, he didn't say it here, but he's got another video online that was a little longer. I know you had to condense it a little bit. He did say education is key, and I agree with that. But I think you have to pay attention to what school is teaching you. And don't you think that's kind of true as a general rule with our government school system specifically? And that there's definitely a bias in the information chain. And I think many in the Austrian School of Economics would say that the traditional schools of economics that are taught, especially in the United States, and that people are degree holders of, who then teach at other universities, and many of them also who write papers in, gloriously praising the Fed or whatever, that they have been taught in simply a flawed school of economics. And so, so while Bob is very convinced in his position, and he's very happy to display his degrees and tell you about his history in that, I mean, I would say Barack Obama is a constitutional lawyer and trained in constitutional law. Let me just say this. What that's known as is an appeal to authority. And it's a logical fallacy. And there's a couple other logical fallacies I'd be happy to point out with Bob, but we won't get into that right now. But I just want to say that I worked in commercial banking for 10 years. I have no formal economic training. I actually left commercial banking as my search and understanding about the nature of the banking system and the money system, as I began to understand what it was, I had a moral problem with being in the banking system. I left a very well-paying job because of what I taught myself, not by reading The Creature from Jekyll Island, though I've read it, but by consuming textbooks from the Austrian School of Economics, textbooks that we've asked Bob to read, even short books that we've asked Bob to read, which is why Brian has asked him to explain Hayek's capital theory, because Bob hasn't educated himself on the Austrian School of Economics. And I can understand that because time is limited. You can only do so many things. So this is a great opportunity for us to talk a little bit about this School of Economics that doesn't get a lot of play. It's partially because it's the only school of economics that ultimately threatens the power of the central government. And I would say that that's one of the reasons why the Austrian School of Economics is shunned, is pushed to the side. And so that's where we're coming from. The other thing I want to point out that I agree with Bob, and he said this on the video that was on YouTube. He said, there are ways to make an argument that are honest but dishonest. And he was insinuating that we're sort of out doing sleight of hand over here with our graphs and things. And I want to submit that I believe that if there's a magician in the room, it's Bob. Bob is the one who carries on more sleight of hand when it comes to this type of thing. And I want to point out something he didn't get to. It was on his slide. But for example, there's something that he referenced in the video online where he says, look, our standard of living's increased. And You can pull up the McDonald's slide. And
Now, wait a minute. Before you said, the reason I went over that was because Dave was telling me to hurry up.
well,
I will
that's
gladly
okay.
cover this one.
No, that's okay. I'll cover it for you.
All right, go ahead.
So,
You're not getting away with this one.
what Bob points out is that the minimum wage was 75 cents an hour. That could buy you 5 hamburgers at McDonald's in what, 1954, I think?
1951.
1951.
Okay, now hold on. Make sure you understand this. If I worked 1 hour, I could buy 5 hamburgers.
Right.
Okay? Now the dollar's been debased since then.
So today, minimum wage, 2011, $7.25. That gets you a quarter pounder's a buck. So that gives you 7.25 quarter pounders. How rich we are. But this is where the sleight of hand comes in, because in 1954, my 75 cents would have been 3 90% silver coins that are currently worth, how much is a quarter going for right now? $6, $7. So actually, if you want to do an equal comparison, is that 1950 minimum wage was 3 90% silver quarters worth $21 in 2001 Federal Reserve notes. Today's minimum wage is 7.25 in Federal Reserve notes, worth approximately 1 1950s quarter. So there's a sleight of hand going on here where Bob wants to compare apples to oranges. The truth of the matter is what? The truth of the matter is our currency has been debased when you compare apples to apples. See, $7.25, how rich we are, and of course these quarter pounders I'm sure are of higher quality than those in 1954, as so many items are, right? They say they don't make it the way they used to. We have a lot of items that have increased in quality, but there are many items that have decreased in quality. Can anyone contend for that?
Correct.
Does anyone remember when it only took one income to support a family? I'm not old enough. And listen, I'm getting some interesting details here, but what I'm saying is the sleight of hand is, hey, we're so prosperous today. Just look at the McDonald's menu. The economy is complicated. It's not that simple. And because we don't get this information taught to us in school, you can chime in at the last minute of our time. The problem is these arguments can be made and slides can be shown. Glenn Beck can get on national TV and not know what he's talking about. And you know what? Most people who watch him don't know the difference. And so we're fighting this battle on this end. I want to just point out some other interesting things that I think, what I want to do is I just want to say, you know, Bob is fast and loose with some things, and he wants to present himself as the authority. The pigs have a central bank. There's a European central bank in which every one of those countries functions under. You know, Ben Bernanke doesn't run it. But when we talk about the Fed is a central bank. We have a contention that the central bank, what Hayek said, what the Austrians said, was that central planning of the monetary policy is what's bad. Bob agrees with Karl Marx that central planning is good when it comes to banking. And Karl Marx in 1848 thought so much of it that he put it in as a plank of the Communist Manifesto. Now, Bob would like to say that he learned that from the founders, because the founders were so fond of the central bank. But the history of the central bank is much more complicated than the central bank began, and then when they shut it down, chaos ensued, and they started it back up again, and how glorious it was. What's interesting is the Federal Reserve, I think this is probably the only bit of progressive era legislation passed overwhelmingly by 298 Democrats, I believe, okay, in the dead of night. All right, that's true. This is true.
No, that's not true.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. It wasn't the dead of night. It was over Christmas weekend. It was the 22nd and 23rd. Listen, I'm sorry about that.
At least we got that qualified.
Sorry about that. There was approximately 76 members of Congress that were probably gone or not voting. Okay, sparsely attended. All right. So yeah, there's some. The question is what piece of legislation rammed through on the 23rd of December, overwhelmingly supported by Democrats, progressive legislation supported by Karl Marx, does Bob Wagner, the head of the conservative cavalry, go out and champion these days? None. It's the Federal Reserve. It's the only piece of legislation I can think of that he would be championing. If Barack Obama passed this bit of legislation in this manner, I don't think you would hear the end of it from Bob Wagner. For some reason, there is a blind spot when it comes to the Federal Reserve. And so we believe that we're trying to expose that blind spot right here. There's some other things I just want to point out, and then I'll hand it back over to Joe. You know, the dollar was chosen as the world reserve currency, but it wasn't chosen yesterday. It was chosen in the 40s, and you know what? In the 40s, at Bretton Woods, correct? Am I correct about that?
You keep talking.
Hang on a second.
We got the cameras on.
That's
you just keep talking. You guys gonna go home and check all this stuff out. By the way,
let me say this. When the dollar was adopted as the world reserve currency,
it was a gold standard.
Was it connected to a gold standard?
Yeah, it was a gold standard.
It was a gold standard. So the faith, I'm sorry, I might got the date wrong. The faith that the world put in the US dollar, was it put in the US dollar when it was a complete 100% fiat currency? No. Okay, so Bob's contention is that if we attack the Fed, the holy Fed, that was the reason why the world chose the US dollar as the world reserve currency, they might abandon the world reserve currency. It would have nothing to do with the United States abandoning the gold standard. And we do not even sit here and champion the gold standard necessarily, because the gold standard may not be what the free market would choose US money to be backed with. What we believe is that history shows that when societies have chosen a free market currency, it has not been paper money. There's been many things, but when central governments gain control over the issuance of currency, over the flow of currency, history proves to us that they tend to debase it, that they tend to devalue it for their own purposes. I know that the Federal Reserve was created around Christmas, and so many think it was immaculately conceived. Right? And the amount of faith that is placed in an institution that is supposedly independent and non-political, however, the president picks the individual. You can go through history and show that Federal Reserve chair people have changed their policy positions based on administration that's documented. Okay? The idea that this guy who depends on his job from the president is immune to political influence, I think is absurd, personally. I don't know about you. So I am not, 1 minute before we're done, you can chime in.
I was just going to ask a question.
Hang on a second, please don't. So what I am going to say here is this. I'm going to say that I believe that the sleight of hand that is going on here is not on our part. We are actually trying to explain economics in a very simple way. We're not trying to throw out a bunch of equations, because we believe that economics is about human action, choices that people make, and that's the only way that it can be understood. And so hopefully when you come out of here, you'll feel like we've presented a clearer understanding of what economics is. And I believe that my cohorts here may have some chiming in to do, because we do have a little bit more time. I don't know if there's anything you want to correct or you want to add in that vein.
I'd be happy to. Do you mind going to the slide that has the charts of all the commodities? And I'll get to that point in a second. So one of the conversations has been around inflation, and again, I mean, there were significant chunks of explaining inflation, or at least the effects of inflation, that, you know, I agree with Bob that Glenn Beck sort of muddled. I mean, a large part of, you know, he's showing you the chart that says, you see, we don't have inflation, we don't have inflation, we don't have inflation. And to a large part, I have no argument with that. No one's sort of arguing that we have inflation, you know, massive price inflation, just to be clear. No one's arguing that we have massive consumer price inflation at the moment. But it's showing, you know, when he showed you the chart of the monetary base, go back and look at the correlation between the monetary base and total money supply. You know, it's not instantaneous that money supply is going to follow the monetary base. Oh boy, that's hard to read.
We have agriculture, we have natural gas.
Agriculture, great.
I'll take livestock, and we have grains.
I'll take agriculture. Who remembers what Bob said? So in the video clip, Beck was going through and talking about agriculture prices, and Bob said it's totally unrelated to the Fed. It is it's strictly due to what?
Drought.
What?
Drought and demand.
Drought.
Drought and demand, right? So we were looking at this last little chunk here, a spike. So did the Chinese suddenly stop demanding food back here? I mean, it fell off a cliff, right? So I mean,
Well, we stopped buying food. That's the point.
all I point that out to you is to say, you know, he's as simplistically assigning that, oh, it has nothing to do with monetary policy, it's just due to drought. Well, that's as simplistic an explanation as saying, you know, as Beck was sort of implying, oh, it's all due to the Fed printing money. Well, no, it's both. So you know, he talked about a couple different types of inflation. So if you look at any given product, certainly there has to be demand elements. I mean, food's not going to just go up if no one needs to eat. You know, if someone you know, made a magic pill that fed you for a year, then no matter what the Fed did, food prices wouldn't go up, right? I mean, they would just keep going down because it's related to demand. But aggregate prices can't go up. You know, if you have a fixed income, I mean, with whatever, I don't mean to apply, you know, on Social Security. I mean, if you make $50,000 a year at salary or job, if food prices go up, you pay higher food prices, right? But you offset that with something else. So something else has to be falling, okay? So, you know, you can pick and choose given prices to illustrate inflation or to illustrate not inflation, but the way that economists typically think of inflation is aggregate prices, and Bob said that correctly. Now the question is, what is aggregate prices? Do you buy the same things that I buy? Do any two people buy exactly the same basket of goods? So in inflation, you have to have a monetary component to have overall price inflation, but it's not going to be the same for any given products. You're not going to have, you know, plus 30% across all prices. It's going to tend to flow into certain products. One of the things that affects where it flows into is how much is the government involved in.
Yep.
So how about take college education? What does the government do? Well, first of all, you've got state-run schools, and second of all, you have the government basically running the federal loans and grants. So, so inflation is going to flow into education expenses, and go look at tuition, right? I mean, going through the roof. Why? Because demand is unfettered, because the federal government keeps pumping money into that, keeps directing money into that. So other factors, monetary policy dictates the overall inflation. Other factors are going to determine where you see that inflation, whether you see that inflation in commodity prices, food, oil, education, etc. And that's probably about all the time I have to make.
Well,
I'd love to go through slide by slide.
We're not done with our time, real quick. I wanted to say, and on this inflation idea too, I think anyone who's out there saying, oh, we're going to have hyperinflation at this point in time or that point in time, or that we'll ever have it. I mean, people can speculate about those things. The truth of the matter is that the monetary base has increased, and while Bob has made some interesting statements regarding that, because at the same time that the Fed pumped all this money into the monetary base, hasn't flown out into the marketplace as much as they've pumped into the base. And so, while on one hand, the statement seems to be, well, the Fed wants the banks to loan money, and at the same time they pay the banks interest to hold their reserves back, which disincentivizes the banks from loaning the money out. And the fact that the Federal Reserve hasn't just bought treasuries. If we could show a graph to show that in an unprecedented way, the Federal Reserve has put numerous bank assets of questionable value on its balance sheet, and something that Bob, and the total I think is about $1.5 trillion between treasuries, Maiden Lane, all of these little facilities that they did to do what? To pull bad assets off of the bank's balance sheets. Why? Because they were insolvent. I worked at Chase Bank while this was going on, okay? I didn't just stumble in off the street. And I'm not Jamie Dimon's right-hand man, but I understand what was going on when that was happening. And so Bob has said in his last presentation, well, when the Federal Reserve senses that too much inflation is happening, what are they going to do? They're going to pull the liquidity out of the banks. Well, the interesting thing is that in many of these facilities, the Federal Reserve paid face value for those assets. So they did not pay 20 cents on the dollar for the assets that you and I in the marketplace would have paid for that foreclosed house at, what, made 40% on the dollar. And these different complicated asset categories of collateralized debt obligations, all of these things, the Federal Reserve paid face value. So when the Federal Reserve, this is speculation, but when the Federal Reserve, if the banks begin to start lending more and more and more, start turning on the spigot because everybody thinks we're in a recovery, and if inflation starts to get out of control, well, the Federal Reserve is going to have to unload some things off of their balance sheet. And the question mark is whether or not they can get face value for a number of these assets. Because if they can't get face value for a number of these assets, then they can't pull out the same amount of liquidity that they put in. Is that making sense? And so, I don't mean to get too technical on you, but these are some of the things that are going on in the background that when Bob says the Federal Reserve has been audited, that is true to a certain extent. And yet, at the same time, for decades, the minutes from the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee meetings were shredded. This is true. This is documented. Robert Auerbach is in Texas. I've spoken to him. He was an investigator into the Federal Reserve. He's one guy who's talked about this. There's others. And so the fact that the Federal Reserve has not been completely transparent for all of these years is absolutely true. The Federal Open Market Committee is not subject to complete light of day. And he says, well, Nancy Pelosi is going to, that's the big threat. It's always throw it back to the left. Nancy Pelosi, don't let her get control of the reins. Well, so the answer is to have an independent, private group of people controlling this who are impervious to influence outside. Because although we look for presidents who are impervious to partisan influence, and we look for representatives, the only people we can find that have the health of the economy and the American people at heart are the board of directors who come from a lot of the major banks and the Federal Reserve chairman who is looking out for all of our best interests. That is what I think many of us are starting to, that myth is starting to sort of fall apart, I think. And I think we deserve more than the transparency that we've gotten. Joe?
Let me just make a real quick comment, and I won't be able to give you the citation, but if you contact me, I'll send it to you. I'll dig it up. But there was a very mainstream economist that did a study on Fed actions and the timing, and found that in an election year, presidential election year, that they tended to lower rates, so get the economy like revving a little bit, ensure their the hypothesis would be ensure their reappointment as Fed chair, right? So just you keep in mind that this Fed chair isn't appointed for life like a Supreme Court justice, who supposedly is immune from partisan politics.
Yeah, that was
certainly
that was documented by a guy named Robert Weintraub as one of the many. One thing I also want to say is Bob always likes to blame Congress for the housing bubble, and we agree that Congress did a lot of terrible, stupid things when it came to the housing bubble. And yet, one way I want to illustrate something is that in the early 90s, there was a guy who was working for the Federal Reserve, who then in 2003 went to work for Fannie and Freddie. But he wrote something called Closing the Gap. He worked for the Boston Fed. He was the president of the Boston Fed. And he wrote a document that went out to all the bankers called Closing the Gap, and it was about equal opportunity lending. And you can check out this document, it's still from the Boston Fed. It's out there, and it encouraged and recommended different lending practices that the banks could adopt, such as ignoring typical debt-to-income ratios, or credit ratings and credit histories for lower-income people, because obviously Congress or different people could, sue the banks if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, right? So this idea that the Fed is kind of like this voice of reason out there, back in the 90s, you actually had documentation going out from the Fed that was encouraging the same lax lending policies that Congress had put into place. And so I think that proves, number one, that they're not immune from political influence, and number two, that they're really not the immaculate conceived organization that many times we're led to believe. And number three, this guy went to work for Freddie Mac actually, afterwards in 2003, which further illustrates sort of the revolving door nature that we've got going on in the public and private sector and things like that. You got guys like Hank Paulson, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was the Treasury Secretary when all this went down. And so we know shenanigans happened in 2007, 2008. We want to know what all the shenanigans were, and we refuse to believe that the Federal Reserve really was just doing everything they could to just march us through and avert the next great recession.
Hey, Jason, let's go ahead. You have a little comment, Joe. Go ahead.
I can just pick one thing that I think is the most important point, and that's understanding the business cycle. It's called business cycle theory. F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics for describing the business cycle theory.
He also wrote Road to Serfdom, correct?
He wrote Road to Serfdom.
Bob's going to describe malinvestment in the business cycle.
If you want, you go to
There's actually a video,
highfreedom.com.
when he's talking about malinvestment, on the meetup invitation, I have a link that explains the Austrian business cycle. So there's a video there. You don't have to take my description. You can just watch the video.
So
I'm just willing to concede the debate tonight if he'll explain it live.
Well, okay, Joe, are you all done then?
Yeah, simplistically, it's you have a central bank, they set rates too low, it creates malinvestment in the economy, you get bubbles, the bubbles collapse. The Fed is we're always responding to the crash. We need to ask the question is why is it happening in the first place? When we ask that question, we get to the root cause of the problem, then we realize the government is sort of creating a problem, or the Fed is creating a problem and fixing it, creating a problem and fixing it. Let's get to a point where we're not creating the problem.
I have a 30-second addendum to that, just to support that point, because I want to bring it together something that Brian said. It's like the Fed is creating this flow, and then the federal government many times sets up these directions through legislation that's going to direct where a lot of that sector-specific inflation will happen. And so they work in concert with one another. And we need to understand that the federal government benefits from many of the activities of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has in 2009, second quarter of 2009, bought 48% of all of the treasuries that were issued. So those charts, the Federal Reserve has been buying more over time, and the federal government can borrow from the Federal Reserve and gets its interest returned back to them. So it's kind of like if you would want to get a loan from your parents, okay, and they charge you 10% interest, but then on your birthday they give you your birthday check, but then they add that interest back on and give it back to you. So that's kind of what's going on there. And again, the government has an incentive to keep the Fed around and for the Fed to sort of keep the policy the way that it should. And so with that, I guess we'll toss off to where we're going.
Yeah. Hey, let's go do this, guys, because we've got about maybe a half hour, and I think we should really. First of all,
20 minutes.
Okay. Listen. First of all, I think we should give a big round of applause for these guys right here. Excellent job.
Did everyone find this informative? I mean, it's educational.
I have a question.
I know you guys want to have questions, so let's go ahead and do some questions. Try to make it short and concise. That way we'll have plenty of time to get everybody in. So maybe you want to just go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, and it's almost a comment really too. I think in today that traditional economics is not comprehensive enough. I think there are unfunded mandates, unrealistic projections, public pension, covering public pensions and so on, that are possibly so out of our ability to bring them into economics, that we could need a supercomputer just to give us this kind of information in the future, or maybe help us. It almost sounds like, applying some kind of quantitative control to our very system. It just could be beyond the capacity of people.
Well, I think the debt that you just hit on, the unfunded mandate. I mean, when you say
Yeah.
unfunded, that's not even funded. So the Federal Reserve has no way to even control that.
Yeah, is it in any of this? Is it in any calculation
and
anywhere?
that's my whole point. I mean, we're
Correct,
blaming
it's
the
not.
Fed for getting us in a hole that it has to do with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, wars. It has nothing to do with the Fed, and we're blaming the Fed.
The Fed is reactionary.
Are we going to have time for me to address some of the
let's get some more questions because these guys have been sitting around. So here's the gentleman right here who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, I want to comment on the Joe's comment about MV equals PQ as if it was some kind of communist or socialist equation or theory, when in fact, and I'm defending Bob here, MV equals PQ is an identity. It's not even an equation or a function.
That's right.
Yeah, V is defined as PQ divided by M.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way to do
I learned this in Milton Friedman's class. I was actually there, and Milton Friedman, I want to bring him up because he was always using MV equals PQ, and he's not exactly a communist. He's
he's one of my favorite economists.
He's a scholar of money. He devoted 50 years to study the monetary system, and he used that, and he would disagree with the statement that it was some kind of tool of central planning. It's just a tool of analysis. And another thing
by itself, that's totally that's accurate. I mean, it's an identity. It doesn't do anything for you one way or the other. I mean, there were a couple of slides where, you know, as Bob said, well, if you increase N, then it's going to have to increase P if you hold V and Q constant. It's just like, that's just true by definition. Right. But I think Joe's point is that to take that as like, okay, well, we're going to take that and manage the entire economy. It's what Hayek criticized Friedman on the basis there's too much aggregation. So just assume that there's just one big blob that you can call output and one big blob and call it price was oversimplification.
I'm shocked.
Hayek,
I mean, Friedman was the one reason I went to University of Chicago, and to now hear after all these 50 or so years of worshiping Friedman as a classical liberal anti-government economist, to hear that he's now in bed with Karl Marx, and
let's clarify a couple things.
I can't even fathom that, just because he uses an identity. But I wanted to say something more about.
Well, let's
I want to say something more about Friedman.
Before let us address
there's something else about Friedman beyond the identity. He talked in his classes about the Fed and controlling the money supply, and he was worried also about the Fed having too much discretion and the Federal Reserve Board having too much discretion. So he proposed, and I think it's in his books, all his conservative books, saying that we should, instead of ending the Fed, we should reform it by just having Congress, or maybe even the Constitution, require that the Fed don't increase the money supply by more than the rate of growth.
Yeah, he argues you replace the computer.
Just replace it with the computer.
And I would argue that's the way.
Some of the criticisms of the Fed that have been leveled, not all of them, but some of them would go away if we would, instead of ending the Fed, we would clean it up.
So,
Brian, go ahead.
Let me address your points. Number one, Friedman did a ton of good and was a huge advocate for free market economics in a lot of respects. Number two, he did favor ending the Fed and replacing it with, basically a hard and fast price rule. Okay.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I thought that you can still have the Federal Reserve, but I have it operate.
Either way you work it.
Take the board away, but still have the Fed.
So I mean that is what he advocated.
Yeah.
And he in many respects was a fierce critic of the Federal Reserve. And I'll also use this just as a quick opportunity to say, it's not what I would favor. I think there are better ways to do it than what Friedman advocated, what Bob alluded to in eliminating the Fed's dual mandate. But I would say that'd be a pretty good compromise.
Okay.
If we could eliminate their dual mandate and focus strictly on inflation. Milton Friedman also said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So, you know, some of these other things that have been concocted to try and explain away aggregate inflation do not comport with Friedman's theory.
Okay, hey guys, remember, we're on a limited time basis. Now, Bob, do you want to respond to either one of the questions or response over here, or do you want to go ahead and go to Jim?
Let me just ask a couple questions because I think it's important to wrap all this up. One, what has the Fed done that's really wrong that you can point to? And two, what do you want to replace the Fed with? Well, we're crucifying the Fed, but I'm looking at what exactly has it done wrong.
Okay, so
what are we replacing it with?
let me just make a quick comment on that. So Bob's saying, well, we want to, Friedman was right, and we really should eliminate the Fed's dual mandate. Well, why? He can't think of a single thing that they've ever done wrong. I don't know why he wants to reform it. I don't know why he wants to go to this price rule, or you know, to make the Fed, you know, run by a computer system if they're not doing any damage. So we first have to agree what damage is the Fed causing, and then we can debate whether the solution is you replace it with a gold standard, whether it's free market money, free banking, a price rule. There are a dozen different proposals put forward by professional economists.
So let's let him go ahead and jump into the first.
The one thing you said was that what damage has it ever done? Okay, I would contend back in the early '80s at 11.9% rates were definitely, and higher, were definitely damage that they inflicted totally on the American economy at a time when it was not necessary.
You're talking about the start of the Reagan Revolution.
Exactly, and they were the ones that put all of these basically price increases. If you look at what happened to cost of goods during that period of time, everybody, because they were chasing so much money, they had to raise their prices.
Why were prices going higher?
Why were prices? Because at that time we were having a problem with the oil in the economy. That was part of it.
And colas.
Well, I don't know about the colas, but I will say, if you take but that's not to obfuscate the point of the fact that they did not have to take that up to 11%.
Okay.
Because there was no, give me any reason that it should have gone to 11%. I will then take back my argument.
Well, I'll give you reasons why you did that. Is because if you remember, during the 70s, we had cost push inflation with OPEC. We tied those into the colas, and so we had what was generated called stagflation. We had what's called spiraling inflation and stagflation. Ronald Reagan came in, and it wasn't necessarily the Fed, but he went to Paul Volcker and said, "You have one and only one responsibility." He said, "Kill inflation." That's it. So when Reagan came in there, because he understood that the only way we were going to get the economy back on track was to break the back of inflation. Then what did he do? Not only was he able to break the monetary inflation here in the U.S., he was able to go over to the Saudis. Let me finish though. Let me just finish.
The inflation rates were up much higher, or it started getting high during the
70s. 74.
Yes, and that was before Reagan. So, if you're saying that did the great job by him saying stop inflation by raising interest rates, that's a false argument because that's not what happened.
Okay, let him
respond. The bottom line is it resulted in it resulted in inflation falling through the floor. 2, it resulted in the Reagan Revolution. 3, he went over and got the Saudis to drop the price of oil, and we killed inflation. But
because he threatened them, because after he got in, the same thing happened with the Iranians. They saw what he would potentially do. They all got off their dead tails and dropped the price of oil, and because of the threat, which is fine. But that caused more. That's what, as you said, what caused it to go up. It was the same thing that caused it to go down.
But then hey
guys. But the Fed did not have to take that thing up at that point in time.
Okay,
and that's
we're limited on time, so let's go ahead. I want to get a question from over here. Jim Beck's got a question over here.
I want to just a couple of things. First of all, George Washington. I'm a history of Washington. I'm a student of Washington. Okay, he did not want a central bank.
Let's look at his actions.
Okay,
I go by his actions.
But his actions were because Hamilton was a really close friend, and he had talked him into the central bank. But during his entire time, he really didn't want to go with the central bank. When the same process came through when Madison had a severe problem with the central bank, his statement is, history records that money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control of governments by controlling the money and its issuance. The process here is that we're dealing with men, okay? And the men have their own ideas at a given period of time. And so they're going to try really hard to do the things that they want to do. So you've got a group of people here that kind of weigh all this stuff and think that that's what's really going to be the solution to this problem. They keep screwing it up, okay? Because they're men, okay? We have laws. They have tried to move the laws around to manipulate this process. Unfortunately, now we have huge oil problems. I understand that it's a government problem, but the Federal Reserve is going to still have the opportunity to kind of dump money into, take money out of, try to control the process that the government is going through because of its failures and non-failing problems. The Fed does have a handle in this, and we need to be able to watch and figure out how we can control that if it's at all possible. It needs to be looked at. That's all I can say.
There's no one that argues. I mean, there's plenty of mistakes the Fed's made. The bottom line is there's no perfect system. My point is it's like democracy. Give me a better solution. You know,
Republic.
You have to have
Republic,
well, that's right. Okay.
Free markets.
Okay, the Republic is a great system. But look at where we are with the debt. Still, we get ourselves in messes. Any system you're going to design is going to have a problem. Any system is going to have the input of man. It's going to be a problem. The problem is, what is better than a system that can result in the world currency, the dollar reserve currency? That's a big challenge.
What time we got to wrap it up?
Well, bring up gold. We got to cover gold. This is, I mean, I'd like to.
Okay, let's get one more question right here, and then go ahead and you guys wrap it up.
The real question, not an editorial comment. What did the framers mean in the Constitution by the words coin money? And also, what is fractional reserve banking?
So after they put the term coin money, they passed the Coinage Act of 1792, where they specifically outlined the weights of all the American coins in terms of silver. They basically just copied the Spanish, the Spanish coin.
I would submit to you that the phrase coin money is probably what it sounds like, and to interpret it any other way is in the same fashion that we're now trying to expand the understanding of the Commerce Clause. Like now, interstate Commerce Clause has been ruled to apply to a farmer growing wheat and consuming it for his own family. It never crosses state lines, he doesn't sell it. And that's been defined as interstate commerce. That same sort of expansive definitional interpretation is how you get from coin money to
Can it be interpreted as print paper?
No, at that time.
Well, how did George Washington do it? The way I look at it is, how did George Washington do it? He used paper money. You know, the point is, they granted Congress the power to coin money. It's up to Congress to decide. The Constitution isn't an instruction manual on how you have to coin money. You know, because I could sit there and say, okay, let's press aluminum and stamp money on it. Instead of being paper money, let's have aluminum foil money. The point is, it's up to us, the Congress, to determine how to regulate that value. He points out the act. They passed an act at one time. This is how we're going to do it. Then you change the law if you don't like it. That's what's happened over time. The unfortunate thing is, the Congress has the power to figure out how they're going to coin money. They've decided to have the Federal Reserve do that for them. That's the system that they've designed.
I want to comment on your fractional reserve comment, but I also want to say, you know, I believe it's Jefferson and Madison, probably all the hardcore guys. They say if you want to understand what we meant when we wrote the Constitution, what are you supposed to do? We'll go back to the spirit and go back to the arguments, go back to the discussions that we had while it was being ratified. And I think you would be very hard pressed to find Bob's position supported, with the exclusion of Hamilton, but really Hamilton didn't even go as far as Wagner goes. But like, of the founders and the states and those who were concerned discussing this, for them to ever think that a fiat currency was that's what they meant. I don't think you can do any gymnastics really to find that in the founders' writings around this time. Jim can maybe correct me on this. The second thing is, and Washington signed the document because he also wanted Washington, D.C. to butt up against his personal property. So he wasn't an angel. Yeah, he wasn't an angel. Hang on.
The fact is, look at his
fractional
actions.
reserve banking.
He
still did it. He
didn't
did a
like
deal.
it. It was a goof. It's where he goofed.
But anyway, fractional reserve banking is simply this. let me make it easy to understand in 30 seconds. If we all go and check our coats at a restaurant, all right, and get claim tickets for our coats, and then that person who's issuing the claim tickets, all right, writes out another, 10 times more claim tickets on those coats, okay? And then everybody who comes has got a claim ticket wants to get a coat, and not everybody can get a coat. That's fractional reserve banking. Because Bob wants to blame. Wait a minute. Wait. Bob wants to blame gold, but wants to blame gold for the fact that 10 times more people want to come and claim their gold with their slips back in all of these days on the gold standard. He's like, gold is the problem. All these people came in all these bank runs and panics because all of these banks inflated their currency beyond what they could redeem in gold and silver. Am I wrong about that, or am I right about that?
I think we
So it's gold that's the problem, not the inflationary actions of the banks.
We got to wrap it up. However, what you heard here is, I can't tell you how difficult it is to have people put words in your mouth and keep your mouth shut. This is going to be
gold is the problem. I have those quotes. Gold is the problem. That's Bob's. We're
going to have a second town hall because I would love to address these issues. The gold standard should have been covered tonight. We got to cover that. The depression of 1907 versus 29. We got to cover. I mean, everything they're saying. Once again,
there's two versions of history on it.
It'll be a very fun topic so that I can address all those claims. If you want to see Brian's question answered, there's a video of it on the meetup thing that explains the business cycle. I'm a big fan of Hayek. Matter of fact, why I got into this field was because of the road to serfdom. It didn't have anything to do with the Federal Reserve, though. And so, however, I want to really thank these guys. The whole key was to make sure you got both sides, and I hope we can do this again because this was a lot of fun for me, and hopefully you found it very educational.
Hey, listen, before we wrap up, guys, I want each guy, Jason, Joe, if you've got any websites you want to talk about, because there's going to be a big audience going to be watching the show tonight. So go ahead and give any websites you want to do, and just thank everybody, and go around down the list, and Bob, and we'll wrap it up. Jason?
Yeah, so I have a radio show on every week. You can check it out at livefreeaustinradio.com, and we interview some interesting economists who disagree with Bob. Also, My Free Society is the nonprofit organization I run out of Austin, Texas.
Okay, Joe?
OhioFreedom.com. There's a lot of information about economics we put out there. There's a 2-page flyer on the business cycle theory that is, I think, a good read.
And I would direct you, if you're here in person, come see me, and I'll give you a couple of short articles that explains the business cycle theory and malinvestment. For those that are watching on video, easiest way to find it is go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and just look for the author Robert Murphy. He's a professor of economics, formerly of Hillsdale College, and he specifically has been engaging kind of on blogs back and forth with Paul Krugman, who's the infamous Keynesian liberal economist, on this idea of the business cycle theory. And at least from my perspective, he's done a very good job of explaining it in kind of common terms, and even Krugman has even come back and gone, that's actually the best explanation I've ever heard. He's 30 years in the business.
Krugman said it was a good description?
He did.
Uh-oh.
Okay. That came from a liberal. Bob, go ahead and give your site and let everybody know too.
I hope everyone becomes a member of Conservative Calvary on Meetup. Just make sure you sign up on there. That's where we schedule these events. If you have a group that would like to host this, Michael, I hope you have us come out to Union County. We love to take this on the road. I think this is going to be a very fun and positive one going forward, especially as we do these more often. We understand where the arguments are coming from. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
You're trying to get it to, there's going to be this We the People conference. We need to try to get it there. If you guys make some noise, see if we can get that. We'll be in town.
Spread the word.
Well, listen, we're going to have a lot more events, and if you guys want to check out my site, Riding the Wave with Dave, RIDIN. One thing I will tell you is that we're going to have some more events coming up, because we've got one on the illegal immigration and our borders being swamped, USA under siege, probably in about a month, with well-respected former ATF agent Mark Lucas, and Bob will probably participate. So, hey, I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. They're a great band.